Okay, so we have all four of our routes so far protected from manipulation by other users who don't own the data. Okay, now you may have found that all of the code we've written for these routes is a little bit repetitive, right? In other words, we have this same try catch block, we have this same const auth token, auth user, blah, 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 and we have, in most of them anyway, some sort of logic checking to make sure that the user ID of the auth token is equal to the user ID of the user we're trying to modify. All right, so you might have found yourself wondering, is there an easier way or a less repetitive way to do all of this? Now, previously, when we took a look at the friend tracker application and how to add this kind of protection to that, we saw that basically what we could do is instead of saying app.get, app.post, app.blah, blah, blah, we could say app.use. And this would allow us to put in some so-called middleware that would apply the same logic to multiple routes. Now, this is one way of doing it, and if you recall, this saved us quite a bit of repetitive code, but this is not the only way to do it, and in particular, our needs for this application are going to be different than what we saw with our friend tracker application. Okay, so with this application, what we're going to want to allow users to do is share data, right? We're going to want to allow them to share their notes with each other. So in other words, at this point, we could simplify probably by pulling this kind of logic out into some middleware. But once we get to doing things like sharing notes, we're not going to want that there on every route, because there are going to be instances when a user should be able to read or update a note where they don't actually own that note, okay? Now, the point here is that we need something that will allow us to be a little bit more granular with the logic that we write inside our routes that protects them without being as repetitive as we've been up here. So what we're going to do, I'm going to show you a way to add middleware to different routes in an Express application without having to add it to all of the routes. Now, to do this, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a new folder inside our backend, which we'll call middleware. And this is basically going to contain all of the code that will protect our routes in one way or another. Okay, there's going to end up being quite a few things that will add to this. Okay, so the first thing here is going to be a middleware function that will make sure that the user has included this auth token and that auth token is valid. And what we'll call that something like verify auth token.js. And here's what this is going to look like. This is going to be a middleware function that we're exporting here. And if you recall from when we saw this earlier in our friend tracker application, when we create a middleware function, it has 3 arguments. So if we say export verify auth token equals, and this should be export const verify auth token. This has 3 arguments: request and response. These are the same things as we would have seen in any other route handler. And additionally, it has a next function, which will basically turn control of the program over to whatever the next middleware or the corresponding route handler for the request would be. All right, so this is basically just a callback that we can call to say, okay, we're done. Whatever the route handler is, take it away. All right, and what we're going to do inside this verify auth token thing is make sure that the auth token that the user has provided on their request is valid. Okay, so all that's going to look like is we're going to say try and catch. And this is going to look very familiar to you. We're going to say import all as admin from Firebase admin. And then we're going to go down here and say const auth token equals request.headers, right? We're able to access the request headers and all information about the request inside our middleware function, just like we were in our route handlers. And once we've got that, we're going to say const auth user equals await admin.auth.verify ID token auth token. Okay, and then in the catch block, we're obviously going to say response.sendStatus 401. And that's it. The only other thing we have to do is call the next callback from inside the try catch block, or inside the try block, that is. And that will basically say everything is good. you can continue executing, the route handler or whatever's next can continue the program from here. Awesome. So that's our first middleware function that we've defined specifically for this purpose. So how do we add this thing to routes? Well, if we open up our server.js file, the normal way of adding middleware to all of the routes in our application, which admittedly we would want to do in this case, would be to do something like this. We would just say app.use and pass that middleware function here. What do we call it? Verify auth token. We would pass that there, and that would take care of basically making sure that the auth token was valid before allowing it to go on to the next route. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. However, if we want to take a more granular approach and allow ourselves to add different middleware to different routes, there's a different way that I'm going to show you, and that is that we're able to add middleware onto specific routes simply by passing it as an argument in between the path and the route handler when we say app.get, app.post, etc. Right? So in other words, we could say app.get. The first thing here would be the path. The second thing here would be a middleware function of some sort. So request, response, next, etc. Blah, blah, blah. And then we would have the actual handler for the route, which would be request, response, etc. Now that might seem a little silly to have these two things in a row, and the main advantage of that is it allows us to define middleware in its separate file and reuse it with different routes. So what we can do with our verify auth token middleware, if we want to add it to all of our routes right now, we can just add that right in here by saying verify auth token. And that will take care of verifying the token on all of our routes without us having to include that same logic over and over and over again like we've been doing. Okay, so one thing I want to do before this will actually work is this auth user thing. In order for us to not have to call this same exact function inside the rest of our routes, we're going to have to make this available to the rest of our routes. And as you might remember from our friend tracker application, we can set this auth user as a property on the request itself by saying something like request.user equals auth user. All this does is just sets a user property on the request that we can then access from inside our routes that are behind this middleware function. Okay, so in other words, routes that don't use this, as we'll see later on, will not be able to access request.user because it won't have been set. Okay, so now what we can do, now that we've added this middleware to all of our routes, we can actually go into each of those routes. So we'll start off with create note route, I suppose. And instead of having to get the auth token and get the auth user, we can just say const auth user, oops, there we go, equals request.user. And everything should work just like before without us having to use the try catch block. And we can even remove this try catch block, which I highly recommend. And we can also remove the catch response.sendStatus thing down at the bottom here because that's all taken care of for us inside this verify auth token middleware function that we created. All right, and we can also remove the Firebase admin import since we don't need that anymore. So let's do our list notes route now. This is going to be the same kind of thing. We're going to remove these two lines up here at the top. Instead of saying authUser.uid, we're going to say const authUser equals request.user, since we've already done that calculation, and everything should work there. We can just remove the try catch block here as well, and that's all we need to do. All right, next up for our update notes route, we're going to do the same thing, remove the try catch block. We'll remove the catch statement here and the logic there. We're going to unindent this, and instead of saying auth token auth user, we're going to say const auth user equals request.user. And last but not least, we're going to do that for our delete note route. We're going to delete the try catch block. All right, so delete this here, unindent this, and remove the top two lines and replace them with const auth user equals, oops, there we go, auth user equals request.user. And there we go. So let's make sure that everything's working. It looks like I have a Babel error, and I think that that has to do with not putting async on our middleware function here. Yep, sure enough, we need to say async, and that should take care of that. So there we go. We see that our server's running. So let's go back and test all of our routes using our application here. Let's refresh it. It should load all our notes. We can click on one. We can edit it. We can save it. That works. We can now go back here and delete a note. And that works too. And likewise, if we create a note, we'll say hello and click create. And sure enough, that note shows up. So everything is working just the same way as before. If you want to test out the protection mechanisms using Postman, feel free to do so. I'm just going to send one here and we'll see that we get the same thing back. Feel free to go through all the routes with that if you want to be a little bit paranoid, which is a good idea when working with user authentication. And that's basically all we need to do. So the next thing that I want to show you here, now that we've added this verify auth token middleware and added it to all of our routes, here, let's just go back to our server file. In general, we're going to want to be able to add middleware to specific routes. So what I'm going to recommend we do instead of what we did here, right, just putting the middleware function directly in when we're mapping through all of our routes, what I'm going to recommend we do is on each specific route object that we define, in addition to having path, method, handler, etc., what we're going to do is we're going to add another property to these objects, which will be called something like middleware. Oops, let me spell that right there, middleware. And what this will do is it'll allow us to define what middleware functions this route wants, right? So this is going to be an array. And inside here, we're going to say verify auth token because we want that on this route. And we can also delete this admin thing here. We don't need that anymore. And once we've done that, we're going to go back through the rest of our routes and do that later on. But just to show you what this will look like, once we've done that, we can say ... route.middleware. And since this is an array, what this spread operator here will do is it'll take all of our middleware and put it as multiple arguments in between our path and our handler, which we're allowed to do in Express apps, right? We're allowed to pass multiple middleware functions as arguments in between path and handler. All right, so we can remove now verify auth token from our imports. And let's go and add this verify auth token middleware to the rest of our routes. I'm just going to copy this. We're going to open up create note route. We'll paste that here. I'll open up our update note route. We'll paste that here. And I'll open up our list notes route and we will paste that here. Okay, and let's delete the admin import from these as well since we no longer need it. There we go, we got it all. And that should be about it for verifying the auth ID token. We've been able to pull that stuff into a single reusable function that we can simply set on all of our routes. So just to make sure this all works still and that I didn't mess something up, let's try loading some data and making some other operations. All right, looks like everything's working so far. Let's add some content, save changes. Looks like that worked. Let's try adding a note, blah, 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 click create. And let's try deleting that note. Yes, and it looks like everything is working. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.